I'd now like to introduce Janet Conway, who's going to give the introductory comments for our panel this evening. Janet is the Canada Research Chair in Social Justice at Brock University and the convener of the global movement Assemblages Symposium. Her research highlights the significance of contemporary social justice movements for democratic and social and political life in the context of globalization. Her most recent book was Edges of Global Justice, the World Social Forum and Its Others, from Routledge in 2013. And I'm delighted to thank Janet for her organizational savvy in drawing us together and to welcome her to present these introductory remarks.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Darren, very much for always reminding us about the importance of a spirit of gratitude. And I want to start with that to say how grateful I am to be here this evening and also to be part of this group that we've assembled for this discussion. So my job here tonight is to introduce the theme of the symposium, to talk a little bit about that. This idea, global movement assemblages. What do we mean by this term? And what is there to talk about for 2 days about this term? Well, first to say that our starting point for this discussion is an astonishing series of popular uprisings that began in December of 2010 and continued with great intensity throughout 2011 and more episodically since then. And of course, I'm referring to, number one, the events that we now know as the Arab Spring, the Tunisian Revolution, the Egyptian Revolution, the violent uprising and civil war in Libya, the ongoing horrendous war in Syria, the uprisings in Yemen, in Bahrain, across the whole region. This astonishing series of hundreds of thousands of people occupying squares and demanding an end to the regime. This was followed in short order by similar kinds of gatherings, again of tens of thousands of people, in Spain in May of 2011, protesting the onset of austerity strategies in the wake of the financial crisis. And across southern Europe, these kinds of occupations happened, again in big public squares, orchestrated through social media, protesting austerity agendas, and explicitly inspired by the events of the Arab Spring. And then in September 2011, in response to a call from adbusters, Occupy Wall Street took place in New York City and then quickly multiplied across North America. So it was an extraordinary year, such that even Time magazine noticed and called 2011 the year of the activist. And since then, there have been uprisings in Ukraine, the Gezi Park movement throughout Turkey, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and other kinds of movements that have also resonated and taken shape in similar kinds of ways. Student uprisings in Chile and in Quebec over tuition fees, and other kinds of democratic uprisings. As usual, no one saw these coming. As usual, scholars like me are scrambling to understand these events. For us who are gathered here, who are sympathetic to many of the currents of these movements, to their calls for freedom, for dignity, and for social justice, it also becomes a question about how our modes of analysis, how our ways of reading these movements, which help constitute these movements, how our modes of analysis help these movements into being, expand their meaning, or shut down their meanings. So that's really our task here, is to think about this in a hard way. Many scholarly observers who have sought to explain these movements, of course many scholars are perturbed that they cannot predict these things, but then they set out to explain these things. And of course people have noticed that there's been a close temporal relationship, that these movements happened very closely one on top of the other in a concentrated time period. But then they also had this incredible spread across global space. And so people and scholars have set out to try to discern their roots and their structural origins. And they have theorized a global wave of contention or a cycle of protest. And they have noted that many of these movements share common characteristics or common features. And key among them are their use of new digital communication technologies in the consolidation of these movements, the sustained mass occupation of public space, their urban quality, the fact that they are heavily peopled by unemployed or underemployed, perhaps overeducated youth, and that they have employed secular, liberal, political grammar of democracy and social rights. These are the kinds of features that theorists who are looking for global connections are pointing to posit some kind of relationship across this incredible, diverse array of movement uprisings in this very short time period. Scholars also note the global conjuncture. They note the timing of the 2008 financial crisis. They posit the imposition of austerity measures in different contexts as prompting these movements. And they point to the deepening and twin crises of both neoliberalism and of representative democracy. Now that's all fine. Within that kind of reading of this global assemblage, I would say that there are three broadly, they're overlapping, but three broad kind of lines of interpretation. One is a kind of line that posits that these movements reflect liberal modernization. In other words, they reflect the globalization as modernization, of the spread of institutions of the modern state, of civil societies, and that this is a fourth wave of democratization. A second dominant tradition of interpretation is Marxian inspired, and it talks about neoliberal capitalism, around mounting dispossession, and about calls for economic justice, and sees these movements of 2011 in the lineage of the global left. So the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, the World Revolution of 1968, and more recently the global justice movement. And so they see it within that trajectory of the global left. A third dominant tradition of reading we could call the Techno Utopians. And this, of course, leading among them is the work of Manuel Castells, who basically posits that that these movements are really the product of new information technologies, that they are a product of the internet as an autonomous space in which individuals find each other and move from outrage to hope, and then gather in public squares and demand the downfall of the regime. And in many ways, that reading is a gloss on the others. It's a form of, it's a theorization really, of the globalization of modernity. Now, these are the available ways of understanding the connections among these astonishing events of 2011. And there's no doubt about the significance of those events. The problem is, and this is part of the problem that's animating our symposium, is that these readings of the global wave of contention, which arise from Western social science, basically are underpinned by an assumption of the globalization of Eurocentric modernity. And this has enormous consequences for their conception of what is a social movement, for their understanding of what is political, and for who they privilege as political subjects. Sometimes they have come now to see, in the wake of the Arab Spring especially, social movements in the non-West, but they see them in their similarity to movements as they have unfolded in the West. They see actors that are in keeping with actors that have appeared in the West. They see ways of being political that are familiar. And so this presents a question to us about the adequacy of these ways of understanding this global assemblage and the relations between these movements and their possible meaning. And so this has provoked us to organize this symposium. And to this we're proposing two traditions of thought to try to stir the pot. One of these is a loose grouping of scholarship that's known as assemblage thinking. And the notion of assemblage originates with Deleuze and Guattari. And to put it very, very simply, the notion of assemblage pushes us to ask again, what is this thing, X movement, that we want to understand? So I'm just going to use the example of Occupy, because it's the movement of this assemblage that many of us are familiar with and has arisen in North American space, Turtle Island space. I'll come to the Turtle Island part in a minute. What is this thing Occupy that we want to understand? Assemblage thinking pushes us to disaggregate it and to see its heterogeneity anew, number one. And secondly, to ask not only about its human elements, but its non-human elements, and how these have come together in an assemblage. Now, just to give you an example of what I think this can do for us. In the context of the proliferation of Occupy across North America, Indigenous activists were present in many of the Occupy encampments. And they were present from the beginning, and they were present as part of Occupy, expressing support for Occupy, as in fact constituting Occupy. But also from the first moment of their presence there, they were radically unsettling Occupy. Because those Indigenous activists who recognized in Occupy something important, something valuable, something with which they had some affinity, at the same time were saying, what is this language of Occupy when you're occupying Indigenous land? What does it mean that you are occupying when you are occupying Indigenous land? So the Indigenous critique of Occupy, which, let me just say, in the globalist readings of the meaning of Occupy, never appear. They're really invisible, or they're erased as part of Occupy, as part of the Occupy assemblage. That the Indigenous critique of Occupy places in the Occupy assemblage the question of land, the question of history, the question of memory, of Indigenous peoples' history, of Indigenous peoples' memory, of the memory of colonial violence, of dispossession, and also of the reality of Indigenous peoples' survival, their presence, their resurgence, and their being part of Occupy. The Indigenous questioning of Occupy, when it's readmitted into the assemblage of Occupy, forces us to rethink what we think is Occupy. It forces us to rethink, what does it mean to talk about the 99% versus the 1%? Who exactly is the 99% and who is the 1%? What does it mean to talk about the democracy of Occupy in light of or through the Indigenous critique? What does the Indigenous critique of Occupy, how does it make us rethink the practices of the General Assemblies of Occupy, which were so celebrated as an example of direct and participatory democracy, as a critique of representative democracy? How does it make us rethink Occupy's valorization of consensus as a new form of politics, as an alternative form of democracy? How does it unsettle Occupy's race-blind and gender-blind understandings of equality and inclusion? How does it make us think about Occupy's democracy as part and parcel of a settler colonial project? This is an example, I think, of how assemblage thinking, by remixing what we think is Occupy, forces us to rethink what is Occupy. And in rethinking something like Occupy, we can also rethink what its relationship is to these other movements that appear to be so similar to it. If we rethink and unsettle Occupy in this way, perhaps we can rethink and unsettle the global movement assemblage in some important ways. How would centering the Indigenous critique of Occupy help us rethink the global movement assemblage? If we thought about the global movement assemblage by centering the extraordinary participation of women, and we made that a central feature of what is extraordinary about these events, how would it help us rethink the meaning of these events? If we at the same time thought about the incidence of violence against women at the heart of these emancipatory movements, how would that force us to rethink the meaning of the global movement assemblage? The violence against women in Tahrir Square, the violence against women in Zuccotti Park. So in closing, we want to reassemble these movements. We want to reassemble the movements of the post-2010 period. We want to reassemble them via a decolonial critique of Eurocentric knowledge regimes, which have so shaped how we see these movements. And we want to ask what their relationship is to longer-standing movements for social transformation, especially to Indigenous resurgence and to movements for gender justice. So in closing, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our guests in the symposium. We are looking forward to a wonderful few days.